A little girl's desperate cries echoed through the house, her small voice breaking as she begged for someone to listen. "My hand hurts so much!" But the stepmother turned a deaf ear to her suffering, dismissing it as nothing more than childish attention-seeking. Little did she know that fate would intervene in the most unexpected way, when a millionaire rushed in and changed everything. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Rain lashed against the tall windows of Whitmore Manor, each droplet striking the glass like tiny daggers. The sound eerily mirrored the sharp pain shooting through Annabelle Smith's slender wrist. The 8-year-old girl huddled beside the grand piano in the corner of the drawing room, her small frame almost disappearing against the massive instrument's polished wood. Tears streamed down Annie's pale cheeks, catching the flickering light from the crystal chandelier overhead. Her golden hair hung in disarray around her face, partially concealing the bruise forming just below her sleeve. She cradled her injured hand against her chest, afraid to move it even an inch. Across the room, Maria Whitmore reclined in a high-backed chair, seemingly oblivious to the child's distress. The stepmother's posture remained rigid and proper as she delicately sipped Earl Grey from a bone china teacup, her cold eyes fixed on the tempest beyond the glass, watching lightning illuminate the English countryside with calculated disinterest. "My hand hurts so much!" Annie's voice trembled, barely audible above the storm's fury. The words hung in the air between them, suspended in the suffocating silence of the manor's drawing room. Maria didn't even flinch. Her perfectly painted lips merely pursed with disapproval, as though the child's pain was nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to her afternoon tea. The woman's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the delicate handle of her cup. Annie's heart pounded against her ribs. This wasn't the first time her stepmother had ignored her cries. Since Father's passing 6 months ago, the manor had grown increasingly cold, its once warm halls now filled with shadows and unspoken threats. The child knew better than to persist with her complaints. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked mercilessly, marking each second of silent suffering. Annie bit her lower lip to keep from crying out again as she attempted to flex her fingers. A fresh wave of pain shot up her arm, causing her to whimper involuntarily. "Annabelle," Maria's voice cut through the room like ice. "If you cannot compose yourself, perhaps you should retire to your quarters until dinner." The girl nodded quickly, knowing that arguing would only make things worse. With practiced care, she slid from the piano bench and made her way toward the door, each step measured to avoid jostling her injured wrist. As Annie reached the threshold, she cast one final, hopeful glance back at the woman who was supposed to care for her. The matriarch had already returned her attention to the storm, dismissing the child's existence entirely. Annie's small shoulders slumped in defeat. In this grand house, filled with priceless treasures, her pain meant absolutely nothing. She slipped into the hallway, alone with her tears and the knowledge that no one would come to her rescue. The thunder crashed outside as the manor's enormous oak doors flew open with such force that one of them slammed against the wall. A violent gust of wind invaded the pristine entrance hall, carrying with it sheets of rain that spattered across the polished marble floor. Framed in the doorway stood Juan Oliveira, a commanding silhouette against the storm's fury. Water cascaded from his dark woolen coat, forming puddles at his feet as lightning briefly illuminated his determined expression. The household staff froze in place, uncertain how to react to this dramatic entrance. Maria Whitmore's teacup clattered against its saucer, her perfectly maintained composure momentarily shaken. She rose halfway from her seat, lips parting to speak, but the millionaire had already spotted Annabelle Smith huddled by the grand piano. "Who let him in?" Maria hissed under her breath. But her question went unanswered as João crossed the entrance hall with purposeful strides, his expensive leather shoes leaving wet imprints on the marble. Without hesitation or introduction, he knelt beside the trembling child, seemingly unconcerned about ruining his tailored trousers on the floor. His dark eyes, usually sharp when conducting business, softened as they assessed Annie's injury. "What happened, Menina?" he asked, his Portuguese term of endearment slipping out naturally. His voice carried both urgency and gentleness as he carefully took her small hand in his. The child flinched, tears welling up again. João removed a pristine white handkerchief from his breast pocket, monogrammed with his initials in navy blue thread. With practiced movements that suggested he'd tended to injuries before, he delicately wrapped the fine cloth around Annie's swollen wrist, creating a makeshift bandage. "This needs proper medical attention," he stated, not as a suggestion, but as a fact that brooked no argument. From across the room, Maria's face drained of color. The stepmother's knuckles whitened around her teacup as she struggled to maintain her facade of control. The unexpected arrival of this powerful outsider, one with apparent knowledge of the family's affairs, had clearly unsettled her. "Mr. Oliveira," she finally managed, her voice artificially pleasant despite the tension in her shoulders. "What an unexpected surprise on such a dreadful evening." João didn't bother looking up as he secured the handkerchief with gentle fingers. "Some matters cannot wait for fair weather, Mrs. Whitmore." The way he said her name carried a subtle weight that made Annie glance between the adults with wide, uncertain eyes. The child seemed both frightened and hopeful, as though sensing that this rain-soaked stranger might represent something she'd long been without, an advocate. Maria's composure, so carefully cultivated over years of social climbing, began to crack like thin ice underfoot. She remained silent, but her eyes betrayed a calculation, assessing this new threat that had literally blown in with the storm. Annabel Smith stared up at João Oliveira, momentarily lost in the warmth of his gaze. There was something hauntingly familiar about his eyes, kind, concerned, protective, stirring fragments of memory from when she was much younger, before her father had died, before Maria had taken control of everything. "I fell," Annie whispered, the lie catching in her throat. Her small fingers curled protectively around her injured wrist, which throbbed beneath the makeshift bandage. The truth pressed against her lips, desperate to escape, but years of conditioning kept it trapped inside. One wrong word, and there would be consequences later, when this stranger was gone and she was alone with her stepmother again. João's expression darkened as he examined the swelling. "No child gets this hurt from simply falling," he murmured, his Portuguese accent growing more pronounced with his rising concern. "This needs proper medical attention." Across the room, Maria Whitmore made a show of adjusting her teacup on its saucer, the fine china clinking delicately against the silver spoon. Her posture remained rigid, her face a carefully composed mask of indifference that only occasionally betrayed flickers of annoyance. "Children are resilient," she remarked coldly, not bothering to look at Annie, "and prone to exaggeration." The millionaire's jaw tightened at her dismissal. He turned back to the little girl, his voice softening. "When I was about your age, I broke my arm climbing a tree. It hurt terribly, but my mother never left my side." He paused, noticing how Annie hung on his every word, desperate for this moment of compassion to continue. "My mother never left my side." Annie's eyes welled with fresh tears. Her own mother would have done the same. She was certain of it, even though those memories grew hazier with each passing year. "Mr. Oliveira," Maria interrupted, finally rising from her seat by the window, "while your concern is touching, family matters remain precisely that. Family matters." João didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and produced a handkerchief embroidered with blue thread. With gentle movements, he dabbed the tears from Annie's cheeks. "Brave girls still cry when they're hurt," he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. "And brave men notice." Annie bit her lip, terrified of the storm brewing between these two adults, one who controlled her entire world, and one who seemed determined to challenge that control. Her gaze darted nervously between them, calculating the price she might pay later for this stranger's kindness. The rain continued its assault on the tall windows, each drop an echo of her racing heartbeat. For the first time in years, someone was seeing her pain, and for the first time in years, Annie felt something dangerous beginning to bloom in her chest. Hope. The rain pounded against the windows with increasing fury as João Oliveira stood his ground in the center of the drawing room. His voice, firm but controlled, cut through the tension. "This child needs medical attention. I insist we call your family physician immediately." Maria Whitmore adjusted her pearl necklace with manicured fingers, her composure never faltering despite the confrontation. "You're overstepping, Mr. Oliveira. Annabelle is always dramatic about the smallest injuries. It's merely a sprain." "I've seen enough injuries to know the difference," João countered, his eyes narrowing as he studied Maria's calculated indifference. The matriarch rose from her velvet chair, signaling the conversation was over. "Perhaps in Brazil you handle matters differently, but here at Whitmore Manor, I decide what's best for my stepdaughter." She glanced dismissively at Annie, who stood clutching her wrist. "It's nearly bedtime. Clara will take her upstairs." Joao's jaw tightened, but he recognized the battle lines drawn. He knelt beside Annie, his voice softening. "I'll return tomorrow, little one. Try to rest." The frightened girl nodded, her eyes wide with both pain and the strange hope this man's arrival had kindled. Later that night, Annie lay curled on her narrow bed in the servants' wing, miles away from the comfort of the main bedrooms. Her small room, once a storage closet, had only a tiny window that rattled with each thunderclap. Tears leaked silently onto her pillow as she cradled her throbbing wrist against her chest. The manor creaked and groaned around her, its vast emptiness a reminder of how alone she truly was. Since her father's death, Maria had systematically removed Annie from the family spaces, relegating her to this forgotten corner where her cries wouldn't disturb important guests. The soft click of the door latch startled her. Annie quickly wiped her tears, fearing Maria had come to scold her for the earlier scene. Instead, Lucia Costa slipped inside, carrying a small basin and cloth. The kitchen maid's kind eyes immediately assessed Annie's condition. "I brought something for the pain," she whispered, sitting gently on the edge of the bed. Lucia wrung out a cloth soaked in cool water and herbs, carefully placing it around Annie's swollen wrist. "Why does she hate me?" Annie whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. Lucia's fingers paused momentarily. "Some people's hearts grow cold when they should grow kind," she answered, continuing her gentle ministrations. "But you are not alone anymore." She produced a small jar from her apron pocket. "This will help with the swelling, my grandmother's remedy." As Lucia tenderly wrapped the wrist in a clean bandage, she leaned close to Annie's ear. "I'll help you, I promise. And that man who came today, he's a good man." For the first time since the pain began, Annie felt her breathing slow. Someone had noticed. Someone had cared. Annabelle Smith woke to the tantalizing scent of turpentine and linseed oil, fragrances that tugged at memories buried deep within her. The familiar smell drifted through the drafty corridors of Whitmore Manor, beckoning her from her small bed in the servants' wing. Her injured wrist still throbbed, but curiosity pulled her forward, wrapping her thin robe tightly around her shoulders against the morning chill. Following the scent like a trail of breadcrumbs, Annie padded barefoot across the cold marble floors. Each step brought the aroma stronger, stirring fragments of happy memories. Her mother's laugh, the scratch of bristles against canvas, afternoons spent watching colors blend and dance. The path led her to a door she hadn't approached in years, her mother's art studio, sealed shut since her passing. To her astonishment, João Oliveira stood before it, his powerful frame silhouetted against the morning light streaming through nearby windows. The mysterious millionaire, was turning a heavy brass key in the lock, the mechanism protesting with years of disuse. When he noticed her, his stern expression softened. "I thought you might find your way here," he said, pushing the door open. Dust particles danced in the shaft of light that cut through the darkness of the long-abandoned room. "Come!" Annie hesitated at the threshold, feeling as though she stood at the edge of the past itself. The studio remained exactly as her mother had left it. Easels draped in cloth, jars of brushes frozen in time, canvases stacked against walls. Only now, a clean workspace had been prepared in the center, sunlight from the tall windows illuminating it like a stage. "Your mother wanted you to have this," João said softly, his Portuguese accent more pronounced with emotion. He handed her a leather case containing a set of fresh sable brushes and a pristine canvas. "She always said your hands were meant to create beauty, not to suffer." Annie's breath caught in her throat as she accepted the gift, her fingers trembling as they traced the fine bristles. Tears welled in her eyes, but for once, they weren't tears of pain or fear. It was the first time since her mother's passing that anyone had encouraged her to create, had seen her as more than a burden or an inconvenience. "How did you know her?" she whispered, looking up at João with newfound curiosity. The man's dark eyes grew distant, filled with memories he seemed reluctant to share. "We shared many dreams once," he answered cryptically, "and one of those dreams was that you would never forget the joy of making something beautiful." Annie clutched the brushes to her chest, feeling a spark of something long extinguished beginning to flicker back to life. In this dust-covered sanctuary, far from Maria Whitmore's cold gaze, she felt her mother's presence surround her like a protective embrace. Maria Whitmore's fury erupted like a dormant volcano the moment she spotted the open studio door. Her perfectly manicured fingers clenched into fists at the sight of Annie's small hands, stained with vibrant blues and reds that told their own story of rebellion. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the peaceful atmosphere João had created. The tall windows of the studio framed her rigid silhouette against the morning light, making her appear more menacing than ever. Annie clutched the paintbrush tighter, her heart racing. For a brief, beautiful moment, she had felt connected to her mother again, could almost sense her presence in the familiar scent of oil paints and turpentine. "You are not to waste time on such frivolity," Maria snapped, crossing the room in 3 quick strides. She snatched the brushes from Annie's trembling fingers, her nails digging slightly into the child's skin. "Who opened this room? Was it that Brazilian man? He has no right." Annie remained silent, her eyes downcast. She knew better than to mention João's name. It would only fuel her stepmother's rage. The matriarch of Whitmore Manor had made it abundantly clear that Annie's only value lay in her obedience, not her creativity. "Look at this mess," Maria continued, gesturing dismissively at the half-finished canvas. "Just like your mother, head in the clouds, wasting good money on paints when there are more important matters." She grabbed Annie by the shoulder and steered her toward the door. "The cellar floors need scrubbing. Perhaps physical labor will remind you of your place in this house." Hours later, Annie knelt on the cold stone floor of the cellar, her knees aching and her injured wrist throbbing beneath the bandage João had wrapped so carefully. The harsh smell of cleaning solution burned her nostrils, but her mind remained in the studio, reliving those precious moments of freedom. When no one was looking, she dipped her finger in a puddle of soapy water and began to trace invisible shapes on the dusty wall beside her. First a circle, then flowing lines that reminded her of her mother's favorite flowers. Though they would disappear as they dried, leaving no evidence of her defiance, Annie felt a spark of joy with each secret creation. "She can take the brushes," Annie whispered to herself, "but she can't take what's inside me." In the dim light of the cellar, her finger moved more confidently across the stone surface. Each swirl and curve was an act of quiet rebellion, a testament that Maria could control her circumstances, but not her spirit. In these hidden moments, Annie could feel her mother's presence most strongly, as if she were guiding her hand, whispering encouragement from somewhere beyond the pain and loneliness. The art lived within her, waiting patiently to be freed again. The dust made Annabel Smith sneeze as she dragged the heavy feather duster across the forgotten wardrobe. Maria had assigned her this tedious task, cleaning out the attic storage, as punishment for speaking during breakfast. The afternoon sun streamed through the small dormer window, illuminating dancing particles in the air as Annie worked. Her fingers brushed against something hard as she moved aside a stack of old blankets. Curious, she pulled out a familiar wooden box with faded flowers painted on its lid. Her heart quickened. Her childhood paint box. Maria had told her it had been thrown away years ago. Annie glanced nervously at the attic door before opening the box. Inside were dried-up watercolors and brittle brushes, memories of happier days with her mother. As she ran her fingers along the interior, she felt something unusual, a small bump beneath the velvet lining. Carefully peeling back the fabric, she discovered a tiny brass key taped securely underneath. "What were you hiding, Mother?" she whispered, carefully removing the key. The young girl clutched the key in her palm, its metal warming against her skin. She knew instantly what it might open: the locked drawer in her mother's writing desk, the one Maria had declared off-limits since the day her mother died. The desk remained downstairs, untouched in the corner of the drawing room, like a shrine no one dared disturb. That evening, after Maria had retired to her chambers with a migraine, Annie crept downstairs. The manor was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. She moved silently through the shadows, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might give her away. The writing desk stood bathed in moonlight. Annie approached it reverently, as if greeting an old friend. Her hands trembled as she slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click that seemed deafening in the silence. Inside the drawer lay a single cream-colored envelope, sealed with wax and addressed to João Oliveira in her mother's elegant handwriting. Annie's breath caught in her throat. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter, her eyes drinking in her mother's words. "My dearest João, if you are reading this, I am gone, and the time has come. Protect Annie as you promised. She may not remember you from her early years, but she will need you more than ever. Maria is not what she seems. The truth about the estate, about everything, is hidden where only you would think to look. Remember our song. Remember our promise. Annie is the rightful heir, but more importantly, she is the daughter of my heart. Keep her safe." Tears blurred Annie's vision as hope flickered in her chest for the first time in years. She wasn't alone after all. Someone had promised to protect her, and that someone was already here, fighting for her. Maria Whitmore stood at the head of the dining table, her pearl necklace catching the light as she gestured for the staff to begin serving. The grand luncheon she had arranged was nothing short of a performance. Crystal glasses gleaming, silver polished to mirror-like perfection, and floral arrangements strategically placed to showcase the wealth of Whitmore Manor. Meanwhile, Annabel Smith sat on a wooden stool in the kitchen, her plain gray dress a stark contrast to the finery upstairs. The young girl picked at her modest plate, shoulders hunched as she listened to the clinking of fine china and bursts of polite laughter filtering down from the dining room. "Eat your food, child," Lucia Costa whispered, sliding an extra bread roll onto Annie's plate when no one was looking. The kitchen maid's eyes held a warmth that made the cold kitchen feel slightly less hostile. Upstairs, João Oliveira observed the empty chair where Annie should have been sitting. "I notice the young heiress isn't joining us today," he remarked, his voice carrying just enough edge to make Maria's smile falter. "Annabel prefers simpler company," Maria replied, smoothly, signaling for more wine to be poured. "Children can be so disruptive at formal gatherings." João's eyes narrowed. "Interesting. When I spoke with her yesterday, she seemed quite capable of proper etiquette." The butler exchanged a nervous glance with the footman, a silent communication that didn't escape Wow's notice. The millionaire continued his subtle interrogation, each question seemingly innocent, yet deliberately aimed at exposing inconsistencies in Maria's narrative about Annie's life at the manor. And her education? I understand her mother was quite insistent about arts and music. Maria's knuckles whitened around her fork. We focus on practical skills now. In the kitchen, Annie had positioned herself near the swinging door, straining to catch fragments of conversation. She noticed how the cook flinched when Wow mentioned her mother's name, how the housekeeper suddenly became engrossed in adjusting table linens. "They're afraid," Annie whispered to Lucia, realization dawning in her eyes. "Knowledge is power," Lucia murmured back, pretending to wipe down a counter. "Remember everything you hear." Annie nodded, committing each word, each reaction to memory. She watched as one of the younger maids returned to the kitchen, muttering about that Brazilian gentleman asking too many questions, and how Madame looks ready to shatter her glass. For the first time, Annie understood that Maria's control over the household wasn't as absolute as it appeared. There were cracks forming, small but significant, and João was deliberately widening them with each carefully placed question. By the time dessert was served upstairs, Annie had collected a dozen new pieces of information from the staff's whispers and reactions. She might be dressed in servant's clothes and banished from her rightful place, but in that moment, she felt something unfamiliar yet powerful growing inside her. Hope. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the small servant's bedroom as Lucia Costa carefully unfolded a yellow document on Annie's bed. The kitchen maid glanced nervously at the door before turning back to Annabel Smith with determination in her eyes. "Your mother wanted you to understand your rights," Lucia whispered, her finger tracing along the elegant script of what appeared to be a legal document. "This is a copy of the original will, before your father married Maria." Annie leaned closer, squinting at the complicated words, the 8-year-old's brow furrowed in concentration as she struggled to make sense of the legal terminology. "I don't understand these words," she admitted softly. "That's why I'm teaching you," Lucia replied, her voice barely audible above the occasional creak of the old manor. "See this part? It says the estate passes to you upon your 9th birthday, not to your stepmother." Night after night, they continued these clandestine lessons. Lucia would slip into Annie's room after Maria had retired, bringing not only legal documents, but also letters written by Annie's mother before her death. Together, they pored over the papers by the dim light of a single candle, careful not to alert anyone to their activities. "This is what we call a codicil," Lucia explained one evening, showing Annie a document with her mother's elegant handwriting. "It's an addition to the will. Your mother was very clever. She made sure you would be protected." As the weeks passed, Annie began to understand more than just legal terms. She learned about her inheritance, about trusts established in her name, and about the rights that had been systematically hidden from her. The young girl absorbed everything eagerly, her mind growing sharper with each lesson. "Why are you helping me?" Annie asked one night, her small hand resting on Lucia's. The maid's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I made a promise," she said simply, "and in this house, someone needs to keep their promises." These midnight lessons transformed Annie. Knowledge became her armor against Maria's cruelty. When her stepmother barked orders or dismissed her, Annie now recognized it for what it was, not just meanness, but a calculated effort to keep her ignorant and powerless. One evening, as they studied a property deed, Annie looked up at Lucia with newfound determination. "I'm going to take back what's mine," she whispered, her voice stronger than it had been in months. Lucia squeezed her hand. "Yes, you will. But remember, knowledge is only the beginning. We must be patient and careful." As Annie drifted to sleep that night, legal terms swimming in her head, she felt something unfamiliar blooming in her chest, Hope, yes, but something more powerful. Agency. For the first time since her mother's death, she wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was becoming the author of her own story. Maria Whitmore's grip on the manor tightened like a vice, with João Oliveira's persistent presence disrupting her carefully constructed world. She implemented a series of calculated changes. The staff schedule was completely rearranged, separating Lucia Costa from Annie during most waking hours. Any letters addressed to Annabelle Smith mysteriously vanished before reaching her small hands. And Maria announced that, for security reasons, no visitors would be permitted without her express approval. "I'm merely protecting our privacy," she explained to Paulo da Silva when he questioned the new restrictions. The attorney nodded reluctantly, though doubt clouded his eyes. For Annie, the walls of Whitmore Manor seemed to shrink with each passing day. Her bedroom in the servants' wing felt more like a prison cell than a sanctuary. The 9-year-old would press her palm against the cold window glass, watching birds soar freely over the garden, while she remained trapped inside. "I can't breathe sometimes," she confided to Lucia during one of their rare moments together in the kitchen. The maid squeezed her shoulder gently, understanding the weight of isolation crushing the child's spirit. Yet even as Maria constructed her cage, small acts of rebellion blossomed throughout the estate. Annie began hiding sketches beneath loose stones in the garden path. Tiny bursts of color, depicting memories of her mother, scenes from stories she'd read, and occasionally, portraits of João with his kind eyes. Lucia, despite the risk to her position, slipped encouraging notes into Annie's pockets during mealtimes. "Your mother would be so proud," read one. "Keep your light burning," urged another. These paper lifelines sustained the girl through long, lonely nights. João, meanwhile, observed everything with growing concern. He noticed how Annie flinched when Maria entered a room, how the staff averted their eyes when certain questions were asked. During his daily visits, he began cataloging inconsistencies in Maria's stories, dates that didn't align, explanations that shifted subtly with each telling. "Something isn't right in this house," he muttered to himself one evening, watching from his car as Maria drew the curtains closed, symbolically shutting out the world. The millionaire made discreet inquiries in town, speaking with former employees who had mysteriously left the Whitmore service. Each conversation revealed another thread in a tapestry of control and deception. Annie sensed this shift in João's demeanor. During their brief, supervised interactions, she saw determination hardening in his expression. His questions became more purposeful, his attention more focused. "Be patient," he whispered to her when Maria momentarily left the room. "The truth always finds its way out." Annie nodded, a tiny spark of hope kindling in her chest. For the first time in years, she dared to believe that someone might actually break through the walls closing in around her. The soft glow of candlelight flickered across Annie's bedroom as she dipped her brush into crimson paint. Annabelle Smith had been having the same dream for weeks, a fragment of memory that surfaced in the darkness, demanding to be seen. With each stroke, the image took shape, a shadowy figure looming over her mother's bed, something glinting in their hand. The child's fingers trembled, but she continued painting, driven by an instinct she couldn't explain. The next morning, Annie left her artwork to dry beneath her bed while she attended to her chores. She scrubbed the kitchen floors until her knuckles were raw, Lucia's gentle humming from the pantry her only comfort. When she finally returned to her small room in the servants' wing, her heart stopped. The painting was gone. She found it in Maria Whitmore's hands in the drawing room. The stepmother stood rigid by the fireplace, her face drained of color as she stared at the canvas. When she noticed Annie in the doorway, Maria's composure fractured. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice brittle as ice. "Where did you get these ideas?" Annie's mouth went dry. "I dreamed it," she whispered. Maria's fingers tightened around the frame until her knuckles whitened. "Dreams aren't memories," she snapped, moving toward the fire. The sound of footsteps interrupted her. João Oliveira appeared in the doorway, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. "What's happening here?" he asked, gaze shifting between Annie's frightened face and the painting in Maria's grip. The matriarch's smile appeared too quickly. "Nothing of consequence. Annie has been painting disturbing images again. The child has an overactive imagination, always has." João extended his hand. "May I see it?" "It's inappropriate," Maria insisted, clutching the canvas to her chest. "She's clearly unstable, creating these fantasies. The doctor has mentioned her tendency toward—" "Let me see it," João repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Maria's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm only protecting her from herself." Annie watched this exchange, her heart hammering against her ribs. In that moment, something shifted inside her. The fear remained, but alongside it grew a flicker of defiance. When João looked at her questioningly, she didn't lower her eyes as she always had before. Instead, she met his gaze directly, her chin lifting slightly. In that silent exchange, she was pleading, not with words, but with every ounce of courage she possessed, to be believed. João seemed to understand. He stepped forward, hands still outstretched, waiting. The tension in the room stretched taut as a piano wire. "That painting," he said quietly, "means something, doesn't it, Annie?" The little girl nodded, her voice finding strength from some unknown reserve. "It's not a fantasy," she said. "It's what I saw." The first crocuses pushed through the thawing earth as João Oliveira filed the initial paperwork with the county court. Spring had arrived at Whitmore Manor, bringing with it not just new growth, but the first real challenge to Maria Whitmore's iron grip on the estate and little Annie's future. "This is highly irregular," Paulo da Silva muttered, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed João's petition. The family attorney's hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the documents. His weathered face betrayed the conflict within. 20 years of service to the Whitmore family now colliding with his conscience. Is it irregular to protect a child from abuse? João leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "You've seen her wrist, Paulo. You've seen how Maria treats her." The attorney's eyes darted away. "There are complications. Legal entanglements I helped create that may prove difficult to undo." Outside the window, Annie could be seen in the garden with Lucia, carefully planting seedlings. The sight of the child's cautious joy seemed to pierce something in Paulo's professional armor. "I took an oath to uphold the law," he said, "but I also took a promise to her mother." João watched him carefully, then honor that promise. For 2 weeks, legal documents traveled back and forth. Maria grew increasingly agitated, summoning Paulo to the manor 3 times, each meeting longer and more heated than the last. The staff whispered about raised voices behind closed doors, about threats made and alliances tested. Paulo walked a precarious line. During the day, he nodded along with Maria's demands, but his nights were spent digging through old files, searching for something he had helped bury years ago. On the 3rd Wednesday of April, well after midnight, Paulo's car pulled quietly into the gravel drive of the guest house where João had taken residence. No lights were turned on. The attorney slipped from his vehicle, glanced nervously at the main house, and approached João's door. The sealed manila envelope made barely a sound as it slid across the threshold. Inside lay a treasure trove of truth, bank statements showing suspicious transfers after Annie's mother's death, medical reports with inconsistencies, and most damning of all, a faded codicil to the will. Though unsigned, the amendment was unmistakably in the handwriting of Annie's mother. "In the event of my death before Annabelle reaches majority," it read, "I name João Oliveira as her guardian and protector, knowing his love for her equals my own." When João discovered the envelope the next morning, his hands shook as he read. He glanced toward the manor, where Annie would be waking, perhaps facing another day of coldness and fear. "The tide is turning, Pequena," he whispered. "Hold on just a little longer." Maria Whitmore's control was slipping, and like a cornered predator, she lashed out with her most vicious threat yet. Over breakfast, she casually mentioned arrangements with Thornfield Academy, a boarding school notorious for its strict discipline and remote location in northern Scotland. "You'll leave next week," she announced, stirring her tea as if discussing nothing more significant than the weather. "Perhaps some proper structure will cure your imagination." Annie's spoon clattered against her bowl. The thought of being shipped away, far from João Oliveira and the only home she'd ever known, made her stomach twist into knots. Abandonment, her deepest fear, loomed before her like a gaping chasm. But something had changed in Annabelle Smith. The girl who once cowered now raised her chin, meeting her stepmother's cold stare. "You can't erase me," she whispered, her voice small but steady. "This is my home." Maria's teacup froze midway to her lips. "What did you say?" "I said you can't erase me," Annie repeated, louder this time. "Not anymore." The slap came swiftly, but João entered the dining room just as Maria's hand connected with Annie's cheek. His presence seemed to fill the doorway, his expression thunderous. "That's enough," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Later that afternoon, as Annie sat in the garden, nursing her stinging cheek, Lucia Costa approached with a damp cloth. The kitchen maid had become Annie's only ally within the manor walls, sneaking her extra food and small comforts whenever possible. "He's fighting for you," Lucia said softly, pressing the cool cloth to Annie's face. "And so am I." Annie looked up, surprised by the fierce determination in the woman's usually gentle eyes. "There's something you should know," Lucia continued, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I'm not just a servant here. Your mother was my mother's dearest friend, and João," she paused, emotion catching in her throat. "João was engaged to my mother before she died." Annie's eyes widened. "Your family?" Lucia nodded, tears welling. "In every way that matters. Your mother made me promise to watch over you, just as she asked João. We've been waiting for the right time." That evening, the three gathered secretly in the old art studio. João spread out documents on the dusty table, while Lucia lit candles. Annie watched them work together, noting the familiar way they moved around each other, like people with a shared history. For the first time since her parents' deaths, Annie felt something long forgotten: belonging. This makeshift family, bound by promises and shared loss, had found each other despite Maria's best efforts. "We won't let her send you away," João promised, his hand warm on Annie's shoulder. Annie nodded, her fear of abandonment still present, but now countered by something stronger: the certainty that she was no longer fighting alone. The summer heat descended upon Whitmore Manor like a suffocating blanket, making the grand estate's stone walls radiate warmth even after sunset. João Oliveira spent hours hunched over ledgers in the library, his jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up as sweat beaded on his forehead. The financial records told a story more disturbing than he had anticipated. "Look at these," he said, pointing to a series of transactions as Paulo da Silva leaned over his shoulder. £5,000 to the night nurse, £3,000 to the groundskeeper. Even the doctor received a substantial payment. The family attorney adjusted his glasses, his face paling. All within 48 hours of her death. "Hush money," João whispered, the realization settling like lead in his stomach. Maria paid them all to keep quiet about what really happened that night. Paulo nodded grimly. "I suspected as much, but I never had proof." His fingers trembled slightly as he turned another page. "I should have questioned it more. I failed that child." Outside the window, Annie sat in the garden with Lucia, their heads bent together over a book. The sight strengthened João's resolve. He had promised her mother he would protect her daughter, and he wouldn't fail again. The following day, João and Paulo made their way to the small chapel on the edge of the estate grounds. The stone building stood cool and quiet, a refuge from the relentless heat. Paulo moved with purpose toward the altar, his shoes echoing on the worn stone floor. "She told me once," the attorney said, voice barely above a whisper, "that if anything happened to her, I should look to where she prayed." His hands worked at the side panel of the wooden altar, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a sealed envelope, yellowed with age but intact. Joao's heart pounded as Paulo carefully extracted a document. "It's a second will," the lawyer confirmed, "legally binding and witnessed. It names Annie as the sole heir to everything upon her 9th birthday." He looked up, eyes wide. "That's less than 3 months from now." Back at the manor, Maria Whitmore paced her sitting room, phone clutched to her ear. "I don't care what it costs," she hissed. "Find something on him. Anything to discredit Oliveira before he ruins everything." She didn't notice Annie standing in the doorway, the child's small frame half hidden by the heavy curtain. The girl slipped away silently, her bare feet making no sound on the polished floor as she ran to find Lucia. That evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Joao carefully explained to Annie what they had found. "Your mother made sure you would be taken care of," he said gently. "Will I have to leave?" Annie asked, fear clouding her eyes. "No, Menina," he promised. "This is your home, and now we can prove it." Maria's schemes were unraveling thread by thread, but Joao knew from experience that cornered predators were the most dangerous. As lightning split the sky, he vowed to stay vigilant. Maria Whitmore would not surrender her power without a fight. The manila folder slammed onto the desk, making Annabelle Smith flinch. Maria Whitmore's lips curled into a victorious smile as she showed the documents to Paulo da Silva. "You see? The child is mentally unstable. These medical evaluations prove it," Maria declared, tapping her manicured nail against fabricated reports. "She's prone to delusions, fits of rage, hardly fit to inherit such a vast estate." Paulo adjusted his glasses, discomfort evident in his posture. The attorney's eyes darted between the papers and Annie, who stood silently in the doorway, her small frame seeming to shrink further under the weight of these new lies. Later that afternoon, Lucia Costa found herself locked out of the kitchen, her sanctuary and domain for years. The maid rattled the handle, her face flushing with anger when she spotted Maria watching from the staircase. "This is what happens to those who meddle in family affairs," the stepmother announced coldly. "Perhaps unemployment will teach you your proper place." Annie's art supplies vanished next. She searched frantically through her room, tears streaming down her face, until a young housemaid whispered that she'd seen Maria carrying the wooden box to the attic. When Annie tried to retrieve them, she found the door locked, her creative outlet cruelly denied. That night, curled on her bed in the servants' wing, Annie felt her resolve crumbling. The walls of Whitmore Manor seemed to close in around her, each brick cemented with Maria's determination to erase her existence. "Perhaps she's right," Annie whispered to the shadows. "Perhaps I am nothing." The next morning, Joao Oliveira arrived unannounced, his face grim with determination. He found Annie sitting alone by the piano, her fingers hovering above the keys, but not daring to press them. "Why aren't you playing?" he asked gently. "I'm not good enough," she replied, repeating Maria's constant criticism. Joao sat beside her on the bench, his presence solid and reassuring. "Music isn't about being good enough for others," he said, placing his hands on the keys. "It's about expressing what lives inside you." He began to play, not a complex classical piece meant to impress, but a simple melody that seemed to capture Annie's sadness and transform it into something beautiful. "Now you try," he encouraged. "Play anything, just for yourself." Annie hesitated, then pressed a single key, then another. The notes were tentative at first, but gradually grew more confident as Joao nodded encouragingly. For 3 hours they sat together, the millionaire and the little girl, creating sounds that belonged only to them. No criticism, no expectations, just the pure joy of creation. My mother used to play with me, Annie confessed quietly. I know, Joao replied. She would be so proud of who you're becoming. For the first time since her father's death, Annie didn't feel like a burden or an inconvenience. In Joao's patient gaze, she recognized something she'd almost forgotten existed, the look of someone who saw her true worth. Autumn descended upon Whitmore Manor, painting the surrounding gardens in rich amber and gold. The annual Whitmore Gala, a tradition dating back generations, was approaching, and the estate buzzed with preparations. Servants polished silver and hung crystal chandeliers, while caterers planned elaborate menus for the county's elite. Maria Whitmore supervised every detail with calculating precision. Her sleek evening gown had been specially tailored for the occasion, and her jewelry selection was designed to dazzle. The Whitmore legacy must be represented properly, she announced to the staff, deliberately excluding Annabelle from all planning meetings. In Maria's orchestrated performance, Annie was to remain invisible, a footnote in the estate's grand narrative. You'll stay in your room during the gala, the stepmother informed Annie with cold finality. Your presence would only confuse our guests about the estate's future management. But in the kitchen, Lucia Costa had other plans. The young woman slipped away during her afternoon break, finding Annie hiding in the cellar where she'd been practicing piano on an old keyboard Joao had secretly provided. Tonight is your chance, Lucia whispered, her eyes bright with determination. I found something in the attic. From behind her back, she produced a delicate silk shawl, embroidered with wildflowers, Annie's mother's favorite accessory for performances. Annie's fingers trembled as she touched the fabric. She wore this when she played at concerts. That evening, as guests in formal attire filled the grand hall, Joao Oliveira arrived looking distinguished in a tailored suit. He exchanged meaningful glances with Paulo da Silva, who stood nervously by the entrance clutching a leather portfolio. The attorney nodded almost imperceptibly. Their plan was in motion. Maria glided through the crowd, accepting compliments on the manor's splendor as though it had always been hers alone. She tapped her glass, preparing to address the gathering with a speech about continuing the Whitmore tradition under her careful stewardship. But before she could begin, the lights dimmed unexpectedly. A spotlight illuminated the grand piano in the corner, and gasps rippled through the crowd as Annie stepped forward, her mother's shawl draped around her small shoulders. The child who had been silenced for so long sat at the piano bench, her recently healed wrist still slightly stiff but determined. Her fingers found the keys, and the room fell silent as the first notes filled the air, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. The melody she played was entirely her own composition, woven from fragments of lullabies her mother had sung and the pain of the years since. Joao watched with pride shining in his eyes, while Maria stood frozen, her champagne glass suspended midair as Annie's music told the story no words could capture, of loss, resilience, and the quiet courage that had been building within her all along. The final notes of Annie's melody hung in the air, suspended in perfect stillness as the grand hall fell silent. Not a whisper, not a breath disturbed the moment as Annabelle Smith's small hands rested on the piano keys. The chandelier light caught the tears in her eyes, transforming them into diamonds of determination rather than sorrow. Joao Oliveira stepped forward, his hand protective on Annie's shoulder. Ladies and gentlemen, he addressed the stunned crowd of England's elite, his voice carrying to every corner of the marble hall. What you've just witnessed is more than a performance. It is courage, with a nod to Lucia, who hurried forward with a large portfolio. Joao began to display Annie's paintings one by one. Each canvas told a fragment of that terrible night. The shadow by the bedside, a glint of metal, a spilled glass. Details so specific they could only have been witnessed firsthand. These are the memories of a child who was present when her mother died, Joao explained, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. not the accident we were all led to believe. Maria Whitmore's face contorted with rage and fear. She lunged forward, attempting to snatch the paintings away. "This is preposterous. The child is disturbed. She makes things up." But Paulo da Silva, the family attorney, stepped between them. The elderly man who had remained silent for too long now stood tall, unfolding a document from his breast pocket. "The true will of Elizabeth Smith Whitmore," Paulo announced, his voice cracking with the weight of his long-held guilt. Naming her daughter Annabelle as sole heir, with João Oliveira as guardian until her maturity. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Maria's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The matriarch's hands trembled, her social mask slipping to reveal the desperation beneath. Lucia stepped forward, no longer in her kitchen uniform, but dressed simply and with dignity. "I was there that night," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "I saw Maria enter the bedroom. I heard the argument. I witnessed what happened after." Annie's heart pounded so loudly, she was certain everyone could hear it. She watched the faces of the guests transform from shock to horror to understanding. The truth she had carried inside her for so long was finally taking flight, soaring through the room, impossible to cage again. "You were never supposed to be in that room," Maria hissed at Annie, her composure finally shattering completely. "You should have been asleep." Those words, that admission, hung in the air like a verdict. In that moment, as the crowd drew back from Maria in horror, Annie felt something shift inside her. Not triumph, but release. The burden of silence had finally been lifted from her small shoulders. The courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered the final verdict. Maria Whitmore's face, once a mask of composed superiority, crumpled as the full weight of her exposed deception crashed down upon her. The evidence had been overwhelming: forged documents, witness testimonies, and the paintings that revealed what Annie had witnessed on that fateful night. The court finds that Maria Whitmore has willfully and maliciously attempted to deprive Annabelle Smith of her rightful inheritance through documented instances of abuse, forgery, and obstruction of justice, declared the judge, her voice firm and unwavering. Annie stood beside Paulo da Silva, her small shoulders squared despite the enormity of the moment. The wrist that had once been twisted in pain was now healed, a physical reminder of how far she had come. When Maria attempted one final plea, claiming she had only acted in Annie's best interest, the girl didn't flinch. Instead, she met her stepmother's gaze steadily, no longer afraid of the woman who had caused her so much suffering. "You will vacate Whitmore Manor within 48 hours, the judge continued, addressing the disgraced matriarch. "All financial control of the estate will transfer immediately to the trustees appointed in the original will until Annabelle reaches the age of majority." As the court officers escorted Maria from the room, she cast one venomous glance back at the child who had ultimately defeated her schemes. But Annie wasn't watching. She had turned toward João, who enveloped her in a protective embrace that spoke of promises kept and a future secured. "It's over, Menina," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother would be so proud." Lucia stepped forward, tears glistening in her eyes as she took Annie's small hand in hers. The three of them stood together, an unconventional family, forged through shared pain and unwavering loyalty. Outside the courtroom, rain washed the streets clean, much as the truth had cleansed the tarnished legacy of Whitmore Manor. The family attorney approached them, legal documents tucked under his arm. "The estate is yours now, Annie," Paulo said gently, "just as your mother always intended." Annie nodded, feeling the weight of inheritance balanced by the lightness of freedom. For the first time since her father's death, she could breathe without fear, create without punishment, and love without reservation. The manor would no longer be a prison of silence and secrets, but a home filled with music, art, and the warmth of genuine care. "Let's go home," Annie said, her voice clear and confident, the voice of a child who had found her place in the world at last. Spring had transformed the Whitmore estate, bathing the once gloomy manor in golden light. Annabel Smith wandered through rooms that no longer felt like prisons, her fingers trailing along sun-warmed walls as she made her way to her mother's studio. The space had been reclaimed, just like her spirit. Bright canvases lined the walls where cobwebs once hung, and the scent of oils and turpentine replaced the musty smell of neglect. Annie stood before her easel, paintbrush in hand, creating vibrant scenes that told stories of resilience and hope. Her latest work depicted the garden in full bloom, with 3 figures walking hand in hand among the roses. The small girl in the center, herself, stood tall, no longer the hunched and frightened child who once hid from Maria's wrath. "That's my favorite so far," came João Oliveira's voice from the doorway. The millionaire leaned against the frame, his eyes soft with pride as he watched his ward work. The lines of guilt that had once creased his face were fading. Each day spent fulfilling his promise to Annie's mother had slowly healed his own wounds. "Do you think she would have liked it?" Annie asked, adding a touch of yellow to the sunlight streaming through the trees. João crossed the room and knelt beside her. "Your mother would have loved everything you create," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. "But more than that, she would have loved seeing you happy." Laughter echoed from the hallway as Lucia Costa appeared with a tray of lemonade and biscuits. No longer dressed in a maid's uniform, she wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes. "I thought the artists might need refreshments," she announced, setting down the tray. The 3 of them had formed an unbreakable bond, a family forged not by blood, but by shared pain and healing. Lucia had become Annie's confidant, teaching her everything from cooking to stargazing. Their connection, strengthened by the revelation of Lucia's mother being João's late fiancée, had blossomed into something precious. In the evening, Annie often sat at the piano, her once injured wrist now strong and nimble as she played melodies that filled the manor with joy. The instrument that had witnessed her first cry of pain now sang with her triumph. The halls that had once amplified her stepmother's cold commands now carried the warmth of genuine conversation and spontaneous laughter. Even Paulo da Silva, the family attorney, remarked during his monthly visits how the very air of the estate had changed. For Annie, each sunrise brought new discoveries, not of secrets and lies, but of possibilities and dreams. Her world, once confined to shadows and silence, now expanded with every brushstroke, every piano note, every shared smile with the family she had found. 11 months had passed since that rainy evening when Annabel Smith's cry had pierced the silence of Whitmore Manor. Now, on a crisp autumn morning, Annie stood in the garden, sunlight dappling through the trees onto her upturned face. The wrist that had once throbbed with pain now moved freely as she conducted an imaginary orchestra, her laughter carrying across the estate that was truly hers at last. "Look at what we've planted," she called to João Oliveira, who was kneeling beside a freshly turned bed of soil. The man who had burst into her life like a storm now moved with gentle purpose, teaching her which bulbs would bloom in spring. "Your mother would be proud," he said softly, his weathered hands guiding Annie's smaller ones as they pressed tulip bulbs into the earth. "Not just of the garden, but of you." From the kitchen window, Lucia Costa watched them with a smile that reached her eyes. She had prepared a picnic basket filled with Annie's favorites: warm scones, strawberry jam, and hot chocolate in a thermos. No longer required to wear a maid's uniform, Lucia now dressed in colors as vibrant as her spirit, her position in the household transformed from servant to family. Paulo da Silva joined them later, carrying a leather portfolio containing the final documents transferring guardianship to João. The attorney's shoulders seemed lighter now, unburdened by years of complicity in Maria's schemes. "The judge sends his regards," Paulo announced, handing Annie a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note commending her courage. Annie tucked it into her sketchbook, another piece of validation to treasure. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the lawn, Annie led them all to her mother's studio, now alive with canvases in various stages of completion. Her newest painting stood on an easel by the window, the manor itself, but reimagined with open doors and windows, light pouring from every entrance. "I'm calling it home," she explained, her voice steady with newfound confidence. That evening, music filled the grand hall once more. Annie's fingers danced across the piano keys, not perfect, but passionate. João accompanied her on violin, while Lucia sang softly. The melody they created together echoed through rooms that had once held only silence and secrets. Later, tucked into bed in her new room, her mother's old chamber, reclaimed and redecorated, Annie gazed at the stars through her window. She no longer feared the darkness or the silence. She had found her voice, her place, and her joy, not because anyone had granted her permission, but because she had claimed them for herself. No longer the girl who suffered in silence, Annie was now the heart of Whitmore Manor, a testament to courage, resilience, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds.